Right. Well, I think it's 10:02, so I say we get started. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm so excited to talk with you all about these checklist resources that LFA shared. The resource came across my table a few months ago from a colleague. I work at Vantage Evaluation in Denver, Colorado, and I am the past president of the Atlanta Area Evaluation Association. And I relocated from Atlanta to Denver here a little over a year ago. So that's why I'm in Denver and not in Atlanta, hosting the AaEA Journal Club. And so I just want to say at a high level, the whole point of our conversation today is to, one, briefly outline how LFA articulates the usefulness and value of checklists to promote critical reflection towards inclusive and equitable evaluation practices. And then after that brief outline, I really want to hear from everyone on the line about how you've used either these LFA checklists or any other checklist to promote critical reflection towards these goals. So that's at a high level, and I'll just jump right in. What I thought I would do is share my screen so we can look at something besides my face as I'm kind of going over a high level of what these LFA checklists can offer us. So let me share my screen. All right, can we all see? Great. Okay, so this is just one of the many checklists that they've developed. This one is focused on project design. So at a high level, there are a number of advantages to using checklists. One, they create opportunities to pause and reflect on our practices, right, and our values as evaluators. And they also create really juicy opportunities to remind ourselves and prompt ourselves to reflect and engage our teams and colleagues in discussion on these topics. So it's really easy, as you know, to get bogged down in the day-to-day work, right? And so checklists are a really useful way to get us to just stop and pause and think about our work. So I work in external evaluation at Vantage Evaluation, and we implemented a practice a little over a year ago where we created pause points, which how we define them throughout an evaluation, accompanied with checklists to support the team in both checking in with ourselves internally and then also checking in with the client. So these pause points have created really helpful opportunities for us to integrate these kinds of reflections and questions into our practice more regularly, more intentionally. So, and we are continuing to develop and refine these pause points and the checklists that go with it. So it's definitely a work in progress. The other benefit of checklists is helping us identify potential biases in our work and the choices we make throughout an evaluation. So by bringing in a checklist that forces us to ask questions about the decisions that we're making in that moment and raise up questions that we may not be thinking about. And in turn, these checklists can also help us address these biases, right? They cannot, ensure or force that, but they can create reminders for us to do so. So LFA reminds us in their accompanying information attached to these checklists that they are not intended to be like the end all be all, right? For promoting inclusive and equitable evaluation practices. You can bring the horse to the water, but you can't make the horse drink, right? So instead, these checklists present an opportunity and a beginning potentially. And the other really helpful point that they highlight is that we need to be thinking about inclusive practices and equity throughout an entire evaluation project, including the very beginning when we're making really important decisions around the learning questions, the evaluation questions, the work that we put in on the front end to do the background reading and research and making these like really early decisions about the projects that we work on. And so also, if we think about these types of questions at the front end, that will ensure that one, we put together the right team, right, to do the work. And that also we are thinking through these important questions on the front end, so we don't go too far down a path where we've failed to consider factors like social, cultural, economic context, and fail to think through things like who should be at the table informing decisions when we're going through planning. So at a high level, that's really like an overview of the value of checklists. And so one of my first questions I wanted to ask for everyone on the line is, have any of you used these LFA checklists specifically or any others to promote reflection on your practices towards inclusive and equitable practices?
This is Shalala. I've not used these. Part of why I was interested in seeing them.
Thank you, Shalala.
Yeah, I'll say it. I haven't used these particular ones either, but I feel like the ones that Western Michigan offers, even the ones the CDC has put out for their first 3 steps, are doing a really good job about including that component of reflective practice in there.
Mm-hmm.
So not to this extent, or I might be stepping over the line by saying that, but at least to some degree, maybe not. That's good.
Definitely not.
Interesting that you say that, Chris. Sorry. This is Shalala. I was thinking about it because I've recently used a checklist, and this is totally fast forwarding, but
Yeah.
Often when I use checklists, it's because I'm working on a specific thing, like recommendations or putting together some other part of a report or a project or something like that. And I'm curious to see, I think it'd be good to put more of this kind of reflective thinking into those checklists, because we may not always be in the design phase, for an evaluation project, but we'll be working on things where we need to consider, like, I don't know, how will the team be able to implement these recommendations, not just assigning responsibility or something like this. But I was just curious, in your experience, Chris, because you mentioned it, I was thinking, how do we incorporate these kinds of things in the checklists already, or add them or whatever? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. Shaleva, I think what you raise up is really interesting. The fact that you've often used checklists to support a specific task, right? Like developing an interview protocol or report development, rather than checklists that are not attached to a specific task. Is that an experience that others can relate to? I see some nodding heads.
This is Kirill. I haven't used checklists before, but lately I've had the privilege and opportunity to be working in teams. And so because I'm having to think through sort of each step of the way and think through decisions with team members, I'm reading some of these questions, and these are usually things we're asking of one another. So it would be really neat to sort of make that process a bit more systematic and formal to move us along in conversation as well. So that's why this really interests me, is how can we take what we've been doing but put a structure to it.
That's really neat. Yeah, teamwork is really special. I'm glad that you have that privilege. Has anyone else had any experiences using checklists similar to those we've heard, or different? Both LFA specific and then beyond, so.
This is Chineri. I haven't used the checklist either, but right now we are working with a new team on just a brand new project. And they're asking, do we have any checklists available, or what we can use to kind of go through as they're just learning about the evaluation process and what that means. So this is definitely helpful, just as I pull different resources that we can use. The only other way that I've kind of used more of that evaluative thinking, but I want to add this checklist to it, is when we have people out in the field and they're implementing different programs, having them take a moment after implementing to evaluate just thinking about the process, the barriers that they face, the challenges, and incorporating that into how we evaluate the work.
Oh, that sounds really neat. Yeah, that's really neat. I think one of the highlights in these checklists is around engaging both communities that are being served, right, and those that we're working with through this process. So that sounds like a really cool example of that.
And this is Kendra. I haven't used checklists before, but I think it would be good for me to use in an upcoming project that I have. So I think I'll be looking more into this for the future.
Awesome, thank you. I see a question in the chat from Malloy. How is this checklist overlap, or how does it overlap or diverge from a fidelity type of checklist? Got it. That's a really great question. So when you say a fidelity type of checklist, could you elaborate?
Hi. Yeah, no, just kind of like fidelity to implementation. Because I feel like instinctively you're gonna create a checklist anyway, to make sure that each activity is accounted for. Like, what does that like translate to, right? So I'm just like trying to see, okay, how does this overlap with the checklist that you should be doing anyway? And how does it diverge from that kind of fidelity to implementation checklist?
I hear you. Yeah, so I think, I mean, depending on, so there are an array of checklists within LFA's package, but I think at a high level, an answer to your question is that these questions are much more broad than fidelity to implementation. So they're asking questions about the assumptions we're making going into a project, and they're asking questions about who we're involving throughout phases of the evaluation. So from the design to data collection to analysis. So there are references to participatory methods, for example, whereby you bring in community members who are typically on the opposite end of evaluations, who are either, responding to surveys, interviews, things of that nature, bringing them into the actual data collection and analysis and reporting phases. So in that way, it's a broader set of questions that are getting encouraging evaluators to think differently about how they approach evaluation. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's awesome.
You're
I
welcome.
really like Malloy's question, because one of the ways I could see using these checklists is knowing every context is different. We may not be having to apply each of these elements, but it may be a really interesting thought practice to go through the checklist at the beginning of a project and say, what are the things we know that fit this context that we really want to hold true to? And then from the standpoint of fidelity being, did you accomplish what you set out to do? Going back at your pause points and saying, okay, how well did we do this and to what degree? I think would be a really neat idea and a way to use this.
Yeah, that raises a really helpful point, because I think if you look at, this is one checklist, right? There are a ton of questions and considerations here. I think, this could feel overwhelming, right? Especially if you have pre-existing checklists that you're using, can feel overwhelming if you already have a full plate and you have a lot of work going on. So I think the way you described this around, let's review the checklist and think through which questions feel like the right questions for us to ask ourselves as a team going into this project. That's a great point. Yeah, one of my questions I wanted to ask was, are any challenges any of you have faced in using checklists? So it sounds like for some of you, you haven't used checklists, and others you have. But for those of you who have, what challenges have you faced?
One I seem to run into, well, probably more than I would like to, is in an effort to be very succinct and to the point, they can be kind of vague. So you're not exactly sure what they mean by one thing or another, and then you do it. Anyway, you can see where I'm going with that.
Mm-hmm. So the questions aren't specific enough.
That's a good point, Chris. I was just considering not just experience, actually even this checklist, like if there's a set of either values or principles or pre-knowledge that someone should have before even using the checklist, that
Wow.
would make using it even better. Or yeah, I'm just curious.
That is such a great point, Omoshalewa. That is such a great point. So for example, this question, which is a huge question, how will our project design and approach openly address issues of race, gender, class, power, and oppression, and embody equity? I mean, the term equity itself is loaded and complex, right? Oppression as well. So that's a really wonderful point. Have any others on the line addressed that challenge in any way? I can reflect at Vantage evaluation. So one thing that we are working on is we've done a lot of work as a team around reading literature and having team discussions and reflection opportunities that are structured and then also unstructured to think through how we define equity and like what equitable evaluation means to us and how we want to embody that as a team, as an organization. So we've done a lot of that work in parallel to the development of these pause points and these checklists. And as I said at the very beginning, it's definitely a work in progress. And one of the challenges we face is just going to those pause points and checklists when we intend to. Sometimes when we're really busy, that gets pushed aside. So that's a challenge that we face. I know we're right at 1 more minute to go, but I wanted to see if anyone else had any other thoughts or additions to the conversation.
Well, yeah, we were talking about that specific addressing issues of race, gender, class. I know one of the projects I am involved with, we kind of try to make like a participatory kind of interactions with the participants in our study. So in our minds, like, oh, this is how we're gonna evaluate them, but also asking them like, okay, your class's test scores actually reflect the actual learning of students, and allowing them to have their own like kind of self-determined way of evaluating on their own terms of what they really think reflects like true engagement or participation, learning for their students.
Wow, that sounds really wonderful, because there are definitely different definitions of success and effective, right? So by engaging them in that way, that sounds really, really helpful. All right, well, I know we are right at time, so I want to respect all of your time and close, but please, dig into these checklists. I think they're really helpful, and there are others as well that are really helpful, Western Michigan and CDC's checklist. So I think the overarching point is there's no one checklist that is the best or ideal, but encouraging your team and others to think through how we can incorporate this practice into our work feels really valuable. Thank you all for your engagement today.
Can I add
Thank you so much for organizing.
Sorry, this is so much late. Can I add one small thing for anyone still left on the line? I just was checking out the LFA website, and it does look like they have even a checklist overview document, which you can look at before using one of these checklists. I didn't realize. Sorry if everybody already did, but it talks about even how they think you could use the notes or comments section to the right, because I was trying to figure that out myself. So anyway, that's cool. Great resources. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you, Moshaleva. Yeah, so there's two posts, and both those posts have links to the overview. So yeah, dig in. All right. Bye, everyone.
So long.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.